So currently in F1, we are faced once again with the prospect that a number of drivers could very well be without a drive come the start of the 2025 F1 season. And yes, this could be seen as sad, but it is in fact very healthy. It's a sign that the ecosystem of F1 talent continues as new drivers are introduced and drivers which are felt have no more to offer and don't bring value anymore have to move aside. New blood coming into the sport is excellent and stops any form of stagnation. Now I wish this was the same situation for the teams, but that is a conversation I would like to have at another stage. Now a few of these drivers, it feels like they're coming towards the natural conclusion of their careers, and to us on the outside, that's fine. They've had their success, they've got big trophy cabinets at home, and they've had careers that most drivers and most of us can only dream of. But how they themselves think about retirement and having to leave the sport is a whole different story altogether. And then there are others who won't or may not have a drive next year for, let's say, a variety of reasons. Whether they have reached the end of their usefulness for the team or haven't met expectations, or are simply being replaced by someone who is far more capable. Now as I record this even, I'm very aware that this video could be out of date or irrelevant at any second. So anyway, let's look at drivers who are or may be on the way out in 2025. But before we do, click that little subscribe button below and support the channel. It's all good. Okay, so first up is the always smiling, cheeky, chappy Aussie, Daniel Ricciardo. And one that's always a very complicated issue when talking about his current performance or lack of, versus his past success. Due to some career moves that looked interesting and prosperous at the time, but then proved to be awful, with hindsight, it did rob him of some very, very good years at Red Bull, where he could have very happily added to his trophy cabinet, wins, podiums, points, the lot. And from this whole process of Red Bull, then McLaren, into the abyss, and then back at Red Bull, he's come out the other side a very different driver. And yes, he still smiles for the cameras and puts on a brave face, but there's a sense of desperation and urgency to him that can't be hidden. Alongside Tsunoda, he just seems tired and there's a massive dent in his confidence, and no one can seem to explain why he isn't regularly beating his teammate given all his previous experience. And because of this, he hasn't met expectations at RB. He hasn't lived up to what he promised when Red Bull brought him back in from the cold. And rather than owning some of his poor career choices in the past, it's like he's now trying to correct past mistakes, an impossible task that is just going to end badly. He should be the team leader at RB. He should be that guy that the team is sculpting their future around because they have an experienced race winner for a bargain price. But that unfortunately is not the case. RB need to move on, they need to progress ahead and plan for the future, and it's looking more and more that Ricciardo isn't going to be a part of this. With all the doors that don't have Red Bull written on them in some shape or form now firmly shut, it is going to take something earth-shaking and completely unexpected to keep Ricciardo in the sport for 2025. And yeah, something like a Max move or a Perez sacking will benefit Ricciardo, but he is only delaying the inevitable by a year at the very maximum. Now, I did a video a little while back explaining how I think Daniel Ricciardo would have a very successful and enjoyable career in America at series such as NASCAR or IndyCar. He loves the USA, they appear to love him, it just seems to add up. And I hope that when he does finish F1, it's on his terms. Of course, it's easier said than done, but just retire from the sport with dignity. Admit that you had a really good run, you've had a good show, and now it's time to go and do something else. Now, next on the other end of the success spectrum, we have the ever optimistic but ever under-delivering Logan Sargent. Now, as a Williams fan, I want to be as open and fair about this as possible, and whilst I think bringing in someone like Carlos Sainz is fantastic, I also wasn't thinking, thank Christ Sargent isn't going to be in the team next year either. It was more of that he's had a chance, potentially much more of a chance than he maybe deserved, but it's now time that both parties go their separate ways. So rather than throwing him out the front door, it's more sort of gently walking him to it, leading him out, if that makes sense. Because for all his faults, Sargent doesn't come across like a complete arse like others tend to. He's modest, he has a good temperament, and he tries and tries, but unfortunately it just comes to nothing. Now, of course, the car and the environment at Williams has been far from perfect, but in fairness to him, I think he's been doing much better this year than he has last year. There has been growth, but it's just not enough. Give him another 3, 4, 5 years, he could be a very acceptable midfield driver, but unfortunately, Nobody has time for this, especially Williams. And so with that, it's a certainty that his F1 career will end at the end of this year, and whilst that can be bad news, it might also serve as a bit of a liberation for Sargent. But now he knows what the future holds, and with 10 races still remaining, there's every chance he could end the season on a high note. Where can he go after F1? Well, the obvious bet has got to be America, such as IndyCar, for example. We'll just have to wait and see what that comes to in the end. So overall, a nice guy, but unfortunately just not enough talent. And it's also a shame because it looks like it's going to be a very long time before we see a successful American F1 driver again. Now for this next one, I don't dislike the driver, but can someone please just make a decision and end the misery of Sergio Perez? Now, to be honest, the more that the season goes on, the more people talk, and the more we see Checo deliver poor performances, I sense it becomes clear that there are bigger wheels turning above his head. Pretty much all that Mexican sponsorship money and how much Red Bull are potentially relying on it. And from a fan's perspective, it's almost like Red Bull are having their arm twisted into keeping Checo on board, and there's a sense that this wouldn't fly at all if there was no commercial backing involved. Now, although there's a real impression that Red Bull don't want him anymore, I still think he would be good and deliver value to some teams lower down the order, but unfortunately, all those spots are pretty much gone now. And when you consider the talent knocking at the door of F1, if Red Bull did decide to drop Perez for 2025, which meant that he had to sit out a season, would he stand much chance getting a seat again in 2026? As things stand right now, I think not. However, if Andretti's F1 ambitions are to be realised, then he could be just the driver and financier to get things moving at the team. But to be honest, it is just amazing how far money can get you in Formula 1 and act as a sort of substitute for talent and performance. But if his shortcomings are too costly for Red Bull and an agreement has to be made with his backers and Andretti are not in the picture, then I think this could be the end of the road for Perez in F1. Now, unlike the other drivers in the list, he does actually have an agreement to stay at Red Bull for 2025, but it's not outside the realms of possibility that he could actually be replaced. And in fact, there are lots of people hoping for this because there are going to be knock-on effects that could be felt by the likes of Liam Lawson, Yuki Tsunoda and Daniel Ricciardo, all of whom consider it their destiny to be promoted to Red Bull and would also act as a kind of lifeline to the likes of Ricciardo and Lawson. It might be a long shot, but do you think Perez is going to be without a drive for 2025? Let me know in the comments. So now moving on to F1's resident mustachioed mullet man, Valtteri Bottas. Now, to be honest with you, I kind of get the impression that Bottas just doesn't care anymore. He was seriously affected by his time at Mercedes, so now he's having a bit of a gap year at Sauber, and you just get the impression that he would rather be doing other things. And the not caring thing is interesting because Kimi Räikkönen gave off this impression that he didn't care about F1, but you kind of knew deep down inside him he did. But with Bottas, there's this kind of hipster, immature, overgrown teenager not caring about the sport thing about him that doesn't come off very well. And sure, this might translate into clicks on TikTok and Instagram and things like that, but to the F1 fans, it just doesn't do him any favours. But strangely, Bottas is faced with a situation unlike the others on this list that he does actually have some possibilities for next year. Now, of course, he could partner Hülkenberg at Sauber, the worst team on the grid right now, and help them in their transition to becoming Audi F1. Right now, Sauber are currently sitting on 0 points, and if I was a betting man, I would say it's going to be exactly the same story next year. This means Sauber has to decide between Bottas, who brings in $0 of sponsorship, against Guan Yu, who brings in $48 million of sponsorship, in the form of Chinese backers and investors. And it's not like Bottas has been destroying Guan Yu in the races either. They're kind of more or less equal, maybe perhaps Bottas slightly tipping the favour. But is he tipping it in a way that it's overriding $48 million of Chinese money? Not really. So I sense his only real chance of staying at Sauber is if a team such as Alpine decides to take on Guan Yu's sponsorship money, and it's looking more and more likely that this is going to happen. But there is one final option to stay in F1, and it would only be for just 1 year, and this would be as a last resort option for Mercedes. It's like too many things have to happen to make this a reality. But if none of these things happen and Bottas is left without a drive for next season, I don't see him really as the kind of guy who would go to another motorsport category. Maybe rallying sporadically, but he's not going to do anything full time. He has a very decent business portfolio, he has a family, and I wouldn't be surprised if he just keeps all that ticking over and puts his feet up. And to be fair to Bottas, he's been around for a while now. He's had his success, he's got money in the bank, and there would be no shame if he was to pack it in now. Exactly the same as I was saying with Daniel Ricciardo, just leave the sport with dignity and on your own terms. Now next up is probably the most anonymous driver on the grid this season, and it is none other than Zhou Guanyu. And there's not a huge amount to say here, to be honest. 12 points in 58 starts, and the only memorable moment in his career is flipping his car over at Silverstone. The elephant in the room here is sponsorship money, and that is going to be his only hope for carrying his career over into 2025 and beyond. So the most obvious option here would be to remain at Sauber and then be part of the Audi F1 team when it transforms into that. But I sense if this was going to happen, he would have already been confirmed by now. Sauber could very well sign him up for 2025, but I'm not sure Audi are going to want anything to do with him. Well, why is that, Paul? Well, one of Guanyu's backers is Zeekr Cars, owned by Geely Automotive Group. They make electric cars and are a direct competitor to Audi in the EV market. Audi won't want a Zeekr Cars logo on their cars, so I think it's kind of case closed. So an alternative could be a move to Alpine for 2025 onwards, and yes, the owners are Renault, who also make EVs, same as Audi, but the team has Flavio Briatore as an unofficial boss who will famously do anything for money. And I mean anything. The difference is Audi will enter F1 with morals and will want to do it in a dignified way, unlike Alpine Mark II, which we're going to see next year, who essentially will do anything for a bit of cash. Advertise a competitor's brand on our own car? Sure, no problem. But if Sauber do decide to go with Bottas and Alpine make what I think would be the right decision and pick jackdoohan, then I can't see Guanyu making any F1 comebacks anytime soon. And for Guanyu, there's alternatives outside of F1 such as World Endurance, IndyCar, Formula E, and what he goes to, well, I don't care, to be honest. Basically, Guanyu has done nothing to capture the hearts and minds of F1 fans, and I would much rather someone be in his seat who actually might. So next up is a driver who thought his career should have ended a long time ago, and that is none other than Kevin Magnussen. I actually have a lot of time for K-Mag, although he might have made some enemies through his antics in the past. His outlook on F1 is refreshing, and I enjoy his kind of say it as it is style in interviews. But it seems since it was announced that he would not be retained by Haas for 2025, he hasn't exactly kicked up a fuss about finding a new drive. It's almost like he knew that he was on borrowed time, that this current stint in his career is like a bonus and he's going to get to Abu Dhabi, complete the race, wash his hands and say, job done. There isn't really much demand for K-Mag at the moment, and although we said he isn't interested in any reserve driver positions, it looks like he is going to just ride off into the sunset. Unless, of course, we see Ocon repeatedly being a nuisance at the team and crashing into Behrman, then it might be worth K-Mag keeping his phone switched on and dusting his gloves off. I don't quite see him going to other series, but where I think he would do very well is in punditry. For someone like Sky Sports to have a recent F1 driver in their lineup could be very interesting. It might also add a bit of spice to some of those robotic opinions that we see at the moment. Now, one more here as a little bonus, and it is a driver that I'm getting a little bit concerned about, and it is, of course, Liam Lawson. Now, following his impressive stand-in drives at AlphaTauri in 2023, followed by subsequent, no drives, he's almost becoming a sort of mythical driver where there's a lot of hype and a lot of expectation being built up around him. Now, if things go a certain way, Lawson could be without a drive again in 2025, and if that was the case, he would also become a free agent away from Red Bull to talk and do whatever he wants. But things do move on very quickly in F1, and the conveyor belt of talent keeps on rolling and delivering talent and prospects into the sport. If a Red Bull or RB drive doesn't emerge for 2025, then it might be a bit difficult for him to secure one for 2026. And that would be a shame because he did put in some great performances at short notice, of course, and to see someone of his age already on the F1 scrap heap would be a tragedy. I guess what I'm saying is that if he doesn't have a drive for 2025, is that going to be the last we'll see of him in Formula 1? I really hope not, but you know how the sport does go sometimes. So guys, do let me know your thoughts in the comments of those drivers we talked about. Who is going to stay? Who is going to leave? Let me know what you think. Also, please be sure to like, share and subscribe. And as always, I'm Paul, and thanks for watching. Cheers.